And welcome back, everyone. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm your host, Michael McKay, and we're talking with Dr. Paul Prentice, and we're talking about the moral basis of capitalism. And we have with us our special commentator today, Mr. Christopher Opperman. So, Chris, you had just asked Paul before the break, what is authentic capitalism? And, Paul, you gave a brief answer. Go ahead. I know that you had more to ask Dr. Prentice on that.
Sure. Well, Dr. Prentice, I think very much along the lines of what you said. I mean, we were getting to the idea that the essence of capitalism isn't exploitation or greed, but it's simply freedom and peaceful cooperation. It's voluntary exchange. I think along those lines, there's a helpful quote from Adam Smith from The Wealth of Nations, and he says that little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degrees of opulence, but peace, easy taxes, and the tolerable administration of justice. What do you think of that quote by Smith?
Well, it's a powerful quote. Actually, I have it on the wall of one of my classrooms. It really is striking when you think about it. What it says is that if we have peace, easy taxes, and tolerable administration of justice, he's really talking about a system of limited government and protection of private property rights, of protection of rights, and having the rule of law behind all of that. It's not so much that you would have no law, but you'd have a justice-type-based law, really in the way that Justinian himself was talking about law. Law must be just, it must be fair, and it must protect people equally. And when you have that, and the quote goes on to say that something about people's natural inclination to better themselves, subject to the moral code of not hurting other people, is sufficient to carry them on. So just people left alone. In other words, I get all the time, it's shocking how many policy advisors I run into who ask me opinions, and politicians who ask me about this or that. And my response in each and every case is simply, take your hand out of my pocket and leave me alone. It's so simple, isn't it?
Right.
But that's because human beings are hardwired. We are by nature wealth producers and wealth creators, and it's not that you make people into that. You simply get out of our way. You get out of our way.
I want to jump in here. I had the pleasure of listening to another one of your interviews, and you tell a wonderful story about Cicero and the story of natural law and natural rights. Would you go into that a little bit, Paul?
Well, sure. There's a long and glorious history, of course, of this. Western tradition doesn't just come out of the blue. Jefferson didn't wake up one day and say, Shazam, I've got it, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and nor did John Locke just wake up and say, I've got it, life, liberty, and property. But going way back to Cicero in as early as maybe 50 B.C. or so, he was a Roman statesman, and he traveled around his known world of the time, which was fairly extensive. As you know, the Roman Empire was, in fact, an extensive empire. And he traveled to all the various cultures and lands, and they were extremely diverse, all the way from what we would call now the barbarian tribes of Europe to the more civilized countries in the Middle East, and even off into the Far East and down into northern Africa. And he observed that every society was based on some type of law of some kind, and he saw that he could categorize the idea of law into two basic categories in the following manner. Every society had some kind of set of rules, for example, about what side of the street you could park your horse on, if you will. What he called administrative law. How do you administer, from a legal perspective, the social institutions? And he called that administrative law. But on the other hand, he saw that every society had rules that prescribed against the wanton taking of life and property. There were certain regulations under which you could do these things, but you couldn't just do them whenever you felt like it. And even in Europe and some of the other places, the Druid places, they found you couldn't just go ahead and take somebody's life. You had to have a full moon and an altar, for example. And there's some restriction upon that action. And it was so endemic to humanity, he thought it was like a natural law, sort of like a law of mathematics. He was thinking, as the Greeks and the Romans of the day did, that life consisted of scientific type of laws. And he was thinking, well, gosh, this is a law of human nature, isn't it? Because he saw this everywhere. that there's some sort of natural law. And from this, eventually America gets the idea of natural rights, and our creator endowed natural rights coming out of Jefferson. Go back to Cicero, in fact.
Chris, I took you off your track, Chris, because I know you had some other questions you wanted to insert at this particular point. Please go ahead.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that I guess going back to the thread we've had going about what true capitalism is. I mean, I think we see a lot of this misunderstanding all over the place, generally speaking, especially with the financial crisis and markets and greed and all of this, unregulation are being blamed for the crisis. But I had a question for Dr. Prentice. I mean, in your experience, how does the debate change when people realize that they're not actually criticizing capitalism, but that they're criticizing a kind of crony capitalism, a false capitalism that really isn't a real free market?
Well, you have the crux of the real debate. You ask me, how does the debate change? It's very hard to get people to see that. And frequently when I face them with the facts, when they come at me and saying, well, capitalism just failed, obviously, because the markets crashed. And I said, well, there was not much capitalism in there. Most of those bad loans were directed by and commanded by government policy and government regulators. It was not deregulation that caused that. It was regulation. No capitalist in their right mind would go ahead making loans that they knew they couldn't get paid back. It's just preposterous, right? So one thing I do, and I'll say to them, well, here's an idea I have for you. I'm going to start a company. The company is going to give out loans to people who can't pay them back. Do you want to invest in me? And it kind of shuts them up. They have to think it through. But yes, much of what, actually I would say almost all of what failures are government failures, but they're blamed on the markets. And Ayn Rand mentioned this in some of her writings, particularly in a great little book called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. She's got some essays in there about how it's almost deliberate in the fact that these command and control people, they control an economy, therefore they wreck it, and then they blame the wrecked economy on the market and call for more command and control. And isn't that 50 years ago, wasn't she writing about today's headlines?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's almost
I want to insert here that one of the things that kind of gets me going is when people get on their high horse against corporations, as if the corporations themselves are the real problem, where I see two problems with that approach. One is that it ignores that the fundamental problem is related to what we could call interventionism, which I think is a much better term than corporatism or even crony capitalism, because it really discusses or presents the idea that it is the intervening, if you will, by government that actually is the real problem. But this bridges to the next point that I wanted to bring out, which is about moral hazard. And, the problem is that the focus is on those who took the bait, the bad corporations and so on and so forth. But the better focus is on the bait itself and who set the bait. And that isn't really what is commonly discussed. So, Paul, I'd like to throw that at you in kind of a open kind of way to, let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's amazing. You actually saw into the second part of my discussion of when somebody asked me about this, and I say, do you want to buy in to that business model I just told them? Of course, they say no, and I say, well, how about this? I'm going to make loans to people that can't pay them back. We'll make a lot of money until they can't pay them back, and when they can't pay them back, I'll have someone else pay us for that. Would you buy in then? And they all go, yeah, we'll buy in. So that's exactly what you're getting at. The whole idea of moral hazard, where the incentives are skewed because I, the businessman, would be able to get the profits, the private profits from that activity, but I'd be able to socialize the losses. I'd be able to put the losses off onto the government or onto the taxpayer to make up the difference when they go bad. And that's exactly, once again, what happened in this financial crisis.
Yeah, this is the essential problem with moral hazard, is that it passes the risk to someone else.
Yes, and yes, the person that gets the benefit is not the same person that pays the cost.
Yeah, and Michael, I think this actually was an issue that was raised a lot during the debate over the latest regulation bill that was passed. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the criticisms that one of my economics professors actually raised when he went down to Congress to testify was that the regulations did nothing to change the underlying incentive structure. And so even now, financial institutions, if they're in trouble, the regulations actually encourage them to get run into the ground faster because everyone else will get hit with the risk and with the financial damage. So I think that's a great example of how the incentives are just totally skewed in this case.
Exactly. So, Chris, I'm going to let you set up the next question. We're not going to have time to even let Paul even start to answer it, but please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I guess at the end of the day, I think Dr. Prentice was getting at the point that a lot of the ethical criticisms of capitalism don't always have to do so much with ethics as with the economic consequences that people think come from capitalism, like the exploitation of workers or greed or how people put profits over people. And so I guess we should talk about that a little bit and see what are the real economic consequences of capitalism.
Right. Well, Paul, again, we come into the end of our segment, and I unfortunately, I don't want to cut you off, so I'm not even going to let you get started. Okay. And, but we will come back to this particular point when we get back. So everyone, please stay with us. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm your host, Michael McKay, and I'm talking with Dr. Paul Prentice and Mr. Christopher Opperman on the moral basis of capitalism. And we'll be back in just a second. Please stay with us.